Hey everyone, Mr. Taylor back again to give you the third and final installment in our wonderful tour of muscle tissue. So, last time we went through basically the entire process of how your muscles contract from the time a nerve signal reaches your muscles until the time the muscle actually starts moving, and then how it relaxes again. So, this little diagram that we're looking at right here is just kind of a review of all the stuff that was in the previous lesson. So, if you follow this, numbers 1 through 9, it starts off with a nerve impulse coming from a motor neuron, which is going to cause acetylcholine to go across the synaptic cleft and bind onto the motor end plate at receptors. Those receptors are going to open up and allow sodium to go into the muscle and cause a muscle action potential, which is going to run along the sarcolemma down the T tubules and activate the sarcoplasmic reticulum to open up and release calcium. So that's step 4 that we're at there, releasing calcium. Next, calcium is going to be the wingman that's going to bind onto troponin and move troponin and tropomyosin out of the way of the actin molecules, allowing actin and myosin to bind in step 5, contract the sarcomere during step 6 when we have the power strokes using ATP, and having myosin and actin bind together. And this continues until we stop getting the nerve signal and stop getting acetylcholine, at which point the muscle starts to relax. And that's when we go into step 7. During relaxation, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is actively transporting calcium back into its interior. And at this point, the myosin binding sites on actin get covered up by tropomyosin, and the muscle relaxes. So that was pretty much a summary of everything we did last time. Today we're going to move on to some completely new and different stuff. So first thing we're going to talk about is muscle metabolism, how we get all the energy to make your muscles do all that work. So basically, there are two main energy sources inside of muscle tissue. One is called anaerobic respiration, and the word anaerobic means without oxygen. So this is where we have little to no oxygen being used in the side of the muscle. And, if you know a lot about exercise, there's aerobic and anaerobic exercise. Um, you know, Aerobic exercise is usually like a lighter intensity exercise. Anaerobic is more intense and heavier exercise. Anaerobic respiration, the reason why it doesn't use oxygen is because this can either happen when your body runs out of oxygen, like in other words, if a muscle gets used to the point that it can't get enough oxygen into it, or if it's used quickly enough that it can't get oxygen in. So, in other words, if you're using so much energy so fast that you don't have enough oxygen to come in, you're going to use anaerobic respiration. So that's why, like weightlifting or sprinting, for example, uses anaerobic respiration. And within anaerobic respiration, we have two main pathways or two main energy molecules. One is called creatine phosphate. And creatine phosphate is this really neat molecule that basically helps us to recycle ADP into ATP. So ATP is the direct energy source in all of your cells. Creatine allows us to make extra ATPs to keep your muscles contracting. The other method is what's called glycolysis, and glycolysis literally means breaking down glycogen, or glucose rather. And glycolysis is the process of splitting glucose in half and making two ATPs, and we also make pyruvates. So without oxygen, we're able to use both of those pathways to directly produce ATP inside of the cell. The other way that we can produce energy is through aerobic respiration. And if you look here, it says that there are 36 ATP produced per glucose. So way more efficient than glycolysis, only producing 2 ATPs. So oxygen really helps to increase the amount of energy produced by a cell. So aerobic respiration is preferred, and it's the most common type of respiration going on inside your muscles most of the time. So this explains why, for example, if you do aerobic exercise, you can do it for a long time because you're able to take in oxygen into your cells. They produce a lot of ATPs per glucose using oxygen, and they're able to maintain this level of intensity for a long time. Versus anaerobic respiration, it's very short periods. Like people can only sprint for a few seconds, maybe. People can only lift weights for less than a minute. You don't lift weights for like 10 minutes straight. You have to take breaks in between because the muscles are tired out too quickly. And so, anyway, with aerobic respiration, this is where myoglobin comes in. And so, the key is myoglobin is going to provide oxygen to our muscles so that they don't run out. So, muscles that do a lot of aerobic respiration have a lot of myoglobin so they can store a lot of oxygen. When a muscle runs out of oxygen, it goes into what is called lactic acid fermentation, which is a pathway that extends glycolysis. So basically, at the end of glycolysis, where we split the glucose into 2 ATP, if we don't have any oxygen to go into like the Krebs cycle and start to produce energy that way, we go into acid fermentation, which allows us to keep doing glycolysis without any oxygen present. Now, this little thing down here in the corner, you might have noticed, there's this little thing where it says glycogen. Glycogen is a very interesting molecule. And glycogen is a very long chain of glucoses. And so you can kind of think about this like when you go to buy, let's say you're going to buy pop or soda, it comes in cans. But, when you buy it for like a big party, you're probably going to buy like a case of cans. You're not going to buy like individual cans. Glycogen is kind of like a case. So each one of these molecules, this is one glucose, here's another glucose, another glucose. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different glucoses here. They're all chemically bonded together. So this is as tight as we can pack them together. Just like, a case of pop is like the tightest that we can pack everything together. And then when you want to use one, you just have to take it out of the case. Same thing. Your muscles are able to pop off one of these glucoses from glycogen and break it down and turn it into ATP. And then when you're resting, you're able to restore it back into glycogen. All right, so here's the different pathways shown visually that we just talked about. So the first one is showing you in a resting muscle how ATP and creatine bond together to form creatine phosphate. And creatine phosphate stores that energy from that ATP while the muscle is at rest. When your muscle becomes active, that creatine phosphate is then used with an enzyme called creatine kinase to produce ATPs. So basically, you're storing the energy from ATP while your muscle's at rest so that it has more energy for when it's active. If you look at the second diagram, it's showing you how glycolysis works, how we're able to take uh, either blood glucose taken into the cells from the blood or glycogen present inside your muscles and take that glucose and break it down to form 2 ATPs and 2 pyruvates. And if we have oxygen, we're able to go on to aerobic respiration, which we'll talk about next. If we don't have oxygen, we go into lactic acid fermentation, which is then released into the blood, producing a grand total of 2 ATPs. And then the third diagram at the bottom, you can see here's our our aerobic respiration, where we're taking in either glucose from the blood, pyruvic acids taken over from glycolysis, or breaking down fatty acids. And those are going into the mitochondria with oxygen. And we're going through this cellular respiration process where we're making a boatload of ATP. So about 36 to 38 ATP. We're producing some heat, and that's why your muscles make you hot because they're producing waste heat. You're making carbon dioxide, which of course you're going to have to breathe out. And we're making water. So you're actually producing extra water through cellular respiration. Okay, so we talked about the different ways that we can get energy into your muscle. What happens when we use the muscles a lot? We end up getting fatigue. So if you think about it, using your muscles is kind of like throwing a party. So if we think about like making those creatine phosphates and we think about making all those ATPs, your cells do a lot of work to basically get ready. So just like when you're getting ready to throw a party, you have to like buy all the food and buy all the drinks and clean up your house and get rid of all the trash and make the place look really nice. And then you throw the party. And then when you're done, all the good stuff that you bought for the party is pretty much gone and you have a bunch of trash left. And that's exactly what happens with your muscles. So when you are relaxing, your muscles are getting themselves ready for exertion. You have the actual exercise or exertion that you're doing, which is kind of like having the party. And then when you're done, basically your muscles are trashed, just like your house might be after you had a lot of people over. So fatigue is what happens after we have this big muscle party and your muscles do a lot of work. They can't contract. They're just completely worn out, can't do anything else. And the reason why they can't do anything else, they have run out of pretty much everything. They've used up their calcium, they've used up their creatine phosphates, they've used up oxygen, and they've used up their glycogen stores. So pretty much the shelves are bare. And instead, they have a whole bunch of junk. They have a bunch of lactic acid, ADPs, They have creatines that have lost their phosphates, just a whole bunch of stuff that they really can't use anymore. And at this point, the muscle can't contract. So, just the muscle, when it's fatigued, it has no more juice left. So, what happens when your muscles are fatigued? You go into recovery. And so there's this thing called recovery oxygen uptake, and everyone knows about this. But if you've ever, used a muscle, if you've ever worked out, if you've ever strained yourself, after you're done, you notice that you breathe heavily, that you have to take a lot of extra breaths for a while, even after you stop the exercise. And the reason for this is that you are restoring everything. This is the oxygen you need to take in to fix everything that you broke down. So you are putting oxygen back into myoglobin. You're using oxygen to produce more ATPs to restock the cells. You're using oxygen to make ATPs so that you can restore your glycogen levels, take more glucose in, build more glycogens for storage for later. You also have to take out the trash, so your muscles have to reduce their lactic acid levels. So basically, you're trying to restock, restore everything, and get rid of all the junk that you don't want. So they used to call this oxygen debt. That's kind of like the old school name for it. And the reason for this is that they thought that your muscles had all this oxygen stored, and then you used them and they ran out of oxygen, and then they had to pay that debt back. They had to restock themselves with oxygen. And it turns out that's not really true. The oxygen is used to restore all the other things that are present inside of your cells. So that's why we now call it recovery oxygen uptake. Okay, so that's it for talking about energy. Now we're going to talk about what's called muscle tension, which is how your muscles produce force. And so there's this little thing called a myogram, which is just like a graph or a recording of a muscle contraction. And this is what a myogram looks like. So you see, we are graphing on our y axis the amount of tension, and on the x axis, we're measuring time in milliseconds. And you can see that as we go across time from a single stimulus at time zero, we have a little bit of like a flat area at the beginning where pretty much nothing happens. Then we have this very rapid rise of tension or strength. Tension is basically saying like how much force is being applied by this muscle. And then it peaks, and then we have this relaxation period, which is quite a bit longer, and we go back down to zero. Great. So that little graph we just looked at is called a twitch contraction. And it's just a very brief contraction in response to a single action potential or a single stimulus. So going back to the picture again, we can see we had a single stimulus at time zero, and this was brief. This whole entire process took a whopping 100 milliseconds. So we're talking about, a tenth of a second for this whole thing to happen. All right, so going back, a twitch contraction, very, very brief. Very simple way to look at how muscles contract. So when we look at the twitch contraction, we see that there's three periods: the latent, contraction, and relaxation periods. The latent period is when there's a delay in the muscle response. So from the time that we have the action potential to the time the muscle starts to contract is the latent period. The contraction period is when we have the power strokes happening inside of the sarcomere causing the muscle to contract, and the relaxation period is the return. So if you look, during this latent period, it's about 5 milliseconds. This 5 milliseconds is how much time it takes from the second we stimulate a muscle until we're able to have the muscle action potential spread throughout the muscle cell. We're able to open up the sarcoplasmic reticulum and release calcium. The calcium is able to bind to troponin, and troponin and tropomyosin move out of the way of our actin binding sites. So all those things are happening in about 5 milliseconds. From 5 milliseconds up to about 25 milliseconds. So for the next 20 milliseconds, this increase in tension is where all of a sudden those myosins now start to form those cross bridges and start to pull on the actin molecules and shorten our sarcomere. And so they do this for a certain amount of time, but since they didn't get any more stimulus, eventually now there's no more reason for them to keep doing this. The calcium starts to get sucked back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and now they've maxed out. And now we see this relaxation period where the calcium's going back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum over this time. The myosins and actins are disconnecting, and we're losing our muscle strength. Great. Now, obviously, we don't do everything in twitches. We've probably all experienced twitches, maybe like your eyebrow twitches, or like you feel like a little muscle contracting randomly in your leg or something like that. But obviously that's not the way that we do most of our motions. We would look, absolutely crazy if we did that. So there's this little thing called wave summation. where we basically put a few of these twitches together to change the way that we actually move. So, when we look at the different frequencies that we can stimulate a muscle, wave summation is just where we send a couple signals in a row that produce a larger and longer lasting contraction. And so let's take a look at that. So here's a little graph. Here's our first graph where we have one action potential and we get one little tiny twitch. Wave summation, if we get two action potentials back to back, we get our twitch, but then we get another twitch added onto it. So the muscle stays contracted and increases its strength a little bit more than it normally would. The third area is called unfused tetanus. And unfused tetanus means that the muscle, like tetanus means the muscle stays contracted. So it doesn't ever relax, but it's not fused together. Like it doesn't hit like a plateau. So if we add four signals together, each signal makes the muscle stronger. It keeps the muscle contracted for a long period of time, but it doesn't plateau. So it's a little bit and a little bit stronger and a little bit stronger and a little bit stronger, and then it fades down to zero. The fourth thing that we can have is called fused tetanus. And this is basically where we send a ton of signals from the brain to the muscle. Basically, we're saying go, 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 go. And the muscle immediately shoots right up to its maximum strength, plateaus at its maximum, and stays there until we stop giving it signals, and then it drops off. So those are like our four different types of frequency of stimulation possibilities. So if you look at fused tetanus, it stays sustained for about 90 plus stimuli per second. So when we hit that threshold of giving about 90 stimuli per second, it just stays maxed out. That's as strong as that muscle can pull. Unfused tetanus would be where we have a lot of signals, but not quite as many, not 90 plus. And so now we get kind of like it's stronger, it stays contracted, but it's wavering in strength. It's not like completely maxed out. And then, of course, the wave summation was even smaller than that. The other way we can control the strength of our muscles, besides how often we stimulate them, is this thing called motor unit recruitment. And this is where we decide how many motor units we want to activate. So if you remember, going back to a previous lecture, we said that a motor unit was one motor neuron and all of the different muscle cells that it controls. And so what we can do is when we're controlling our strength, our brain has to decide how many motor units it wants to turn on. So if you pick up something that's really light and you know it's going to be really light, your brain only turns on a couple of motor units to pick that object up. If you had to pick up something that you knew was going to be heavy, your brain would activate more motor units initially to try to pick it up. But sometimes, and you've probably run into this before, you think you're going to pick something up and you grab it and you start to pull and you realize, oh, wow, that's a lot heavier than I thought. And so now you have to like try again and you try harder to lift it. And that's what motor unit recruitment is. It's kind of tweaking how many motor units we're able to use. So this is probably the most common way that we're able to control our strength. All right, so here's another picture showing you this. And so you can see how we can control our strength through this frequency of stimulation, but we could also turn on more motor units to control it that way. All right, another thing to talk about with muscle cells is the different types of muscle cells. So there's actually 3 different types of skeletal muscle cells found inside the body. The first one is called the type 1 or SO, and SO stands for slow oxidative. And so you can guess just by looking at these names, these are slow muscles and they are oxidative, so they use oxygen to produce aerobic respiration. So if you look at these cells tend to be very fatigue resistant because they are using aerobic respiration. They're very small in diameter, so they're pretty tiny little cells. They have tons of myoglobin in use for aerobic respiration, also tons of mitochondria to produce a lot of ATP from that oxygen. They have a very red color because they contain a lot of myoglobin, and they're very slow and deliberate. So these cells don't respond quickly, but they last a really long time. So think about like a marathon runner versus a sprinter. These would be the marathon runner muscles. Definitely have a lot of aerobic ATP generation, like I mentioned, and these are mostly found throughout your neck, back, and legs. So think about like your posture muscles, like in your neck and your back. They're able to keep your head up all day, keep you standing all day long without getting tired. Extremely fatigue resistant, but not something that you would go home and like show off to somebody. Type 2A, they call fog muscles for fast oxidative glycolytic. So these are kind of like your in-between muscles. They are able to use oxygen. So they are oxidative, like type 1, but they're faster and they can also use glycolysis. So these are kind of like in between. So if you look at them, they're in the middle for fatigue. They're intermediate. They're in the middle for the size. They have a lot of myoglobin because they're still doing oxidative aerobic respiration. They still have a lot of mitochondria for the same reason. But if you look at the color is a little bit less because they don't have quite as much myoglobin. Their contraction is faster and stronger than type 1A, which is great. And they're still using aerobic respiration. This is what you find in your legs. So we've kind of sacrificed some of that strength in these muscles for more speed. So they don't last as long, but they're a lot faster than type 1. And the last type 2B, also known as FG muscles for fast glycolytic, these muscles, extremely fast, extremely large, extremely strong, very little myoglobin, very few mitochondria, have almost a whitish color to them. They're very pale compared to the other two types. Very fast. These are the fastest and strongest muscles in your body, but they use anaerobic ATP generation, so they get tired very quickly. So they have very poor staying power, very poor fatigue resistance. And so this is what you mostly find in your arms and shoulders. And if you think about it, your legs can hold you up all day. You could stand for an incredible amount of time. If you try to plank, you definitely can't do it as long as you could stand. If you did like a headstand, you couldn't do it as long as you could stand on your legs. Your arms and shoulders just aren't built for that. They're built to be fast and strong, not long lasting. So it's kind of all like a trade off. Now, that's not to say that you don't have any type 1 or type 2A in your arms and shoulders. It's just that most of your muscle tissue in that area is type 2B. Same thing with like your legs. Your legs mostly have type 2A. They have some type 1, they have some type 2B, but that's what you're going to find there. And here's something really interesting. If you look at the color, it said the color was red to pink, and white for these different tissues. This explains why when you eat chicken, there's like light meat and dark meat. So the white meat is actually found in the upper body of the chicken because it's type 2B muscles. So if you think about a chicken, they're not spending a whole lot of time flying, but they do spend a lot of time running around. So all that running causes them to have more of the type 1 and type 2A muscles in their lower body. If you look at a duck, because ducks both swim and fly, they have to have a lot of type 1 and type 2A muscle throughout their entire body. That's why a duck is pretty much all dark meat and very little white meat. So there you go. All right. And so the last little thing we're going to talk about is the other types of tissue, the other muscle tissue. So we talked exclusively about skeletal muscle in this chapter, but we should also talk a little bit about cardiac and smooth muscle. So cardiac muscle, I think we've already talked about this before, but it bears repeating, contains these very specialized structures called intercalated discs that helps to hold them together, and it also helps them to transfer action potentials from cell to cell. So going ahead a little bit, here is what cardiac muscle tissue looks like. And you can see right here where these two cells come together, we have our intercalated disc that overlap kind of like fingers. So you can interlock your fingers to get a feel for this. And if you look at the intercalated disc up close, you can see it actually has desmosomes, just like your skin did in the stratum spinosum, holding it together. And this allows it to not separate. There's also these things called gap junctions that help it to send action potentials from muscle to muscle. And you can see how the sarcomeres are all kind of like lined up across this cardiac muscle. So there's this little feature of cardiac muscle called autorhythmicity. And basically, autorhythmicity means that the muscle controls itself. It has its own pacemaker that regulates its contraction. So your heart, the reason why they shock your heart to start it up again, or if it has like a problem, an arrhythmia, is because it controls its own heartbeat, which is pretty cool. And we'll talk about that a lot more when we get to the cardiac system, or the cardiovascular system. The other thing to talk about is smooth muscle. And smooth muscle is really kind of weird. It's not at all like cardiac muscle or skeletal muscle because it doesn't have those thick and thin filaments. It doesn't have sarcomeres. It's these things called intermediate filaments. And so they're intermediate because they're really not thick or thin. They're kind of in the middle. And they form a very regular pattern. And you can actually see this. They kind of look like a mesh bag. And in between, there's these little things called dense bodies, which are like those little tiny circles where they come together. And those act kind of like the Z discs. And basically what happens is that all those intermediate filaments contract and pull the dense bodies together and contract the muscle down. And this is not a very efficient contraction. It's not very strong compared to the striated muscles, but it works for things like, churning food in your stomach or, constricting your blood vessels and things like that. So it just works. And that's it. So that's the final installment of our muscle tissue. Next time, we're going to talk all about muscle physiology, and we're going to learn about what all your skeletal muscles do in groups. So we're going to learn about the names of the muscles and how they function. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.